Hello, this is Larry Blank, and welcome to From the Pit number 8. I am sitting with Maestro John Mauceri, who is the not retired music director for the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, and basically not retired at all. We're here to talk about our history, a little bit about Broadway, a little bit about music, and all sorts of things. Welcome, John.
Hi, Larry. It's good to do this with you. We've known each other a very long time.
We have.
I don't know when it all started, but I'll let you be the person to write that chapter.
Well, I'll tell you, it was actually as far back as Candide in 1973, when I was hanging around because of an ex-spouse who was part of the company.
Oh, of course.
And I was actually preparing to be one of the keyboard subs for Albin Konopka, and then I got a full-time paying job, so I disappeared.
I see. Well, we had 3 keyboards.
Yeah.
In that little orchestration. That was quite fun. It was really fun. So did you hang around when it was in Brooklyn or when it went to Broadway?
It was Broadway.
I see. Because we had to expand it a little bit.
Right. And that's when we first met. And then our paths, of course, crossed many times after that.
Indeed. But the Candide experience, because, having that operetta orchestrated for 9 players and then expanded to, I guess it was 12 when we went to Broadway because of the size of the Broadway theater. But what was so wonderful was that we had 3 positions, so the orchestra was surrounded or inside the audience. And that made, it was really wonderful because one little group were the winds with a keyboard, the one was the strings, and where I was, which was kind of the head of the ship, there was the piano and the bass. And of course I was visible to the entire audience, and so I was in costume. But it also meant that when Lenny would write those canons, that the cannons could travel around the room. So da-dum-dum-da-dum-dum really literally went around the room, and it was just such fun to do that show.
I remember that it was very well accepted and well received, considering that the original show in 1956 was not a success.
No, that's right, and every version of it that was based on Lillian Hellman's book was also not a success. So while listen, I'm a guy who restores stuff, so I understand people saying, why doesn't somebody just do the original one? And the reasons for that are someone might do it. I'm not sure where the rights would be for that, but someone might do it and might prove that I'm wrong. But I know that book, and there are 2 shows. There's the play by Lillian, and then there's the music by Lenny. And they're 2 different worlds. Lenny once said about Lillian's book, he said, I think there's one joke in that book, but I can't remember where it is.
How did you get involved with the show, especially the Broadway production?
Well, I'd heard about it, revival. I met Leonard Bernstein in 1971 as a conducting fellow at Tanglewood, and he only was there for a week because he was finishing Mass for the Kennedy Center. So normally he would come for 2 weeks, but that year he came for 1 week. And he only conducted one thing, which was the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven, which he referred to as this other guy's Mass. And so that was a pretty titanic experience for me, because I think, being a kind of smart-ass New Yorker as I am, I kind of never got the Leonard Bernstein thing, the television thing, the sweating and the vulgarity occasionally of Lenny, but also the patrician way he spoke. I mean, I know that people talk about he was the great communicator, but you have to remember that kind of Boston thing that he affected, because he really didn't talk like that. But when he was live on television, it was kind of a turnoff for me. And then I met him, and we conductors were put in the chorus, and it was transformative. I understood why he was so great, and I also understood, it reminded me of why I was a musician in the first place, which is something that you can easily forget in the middle of a summer at Tanglewood with lots of hungry young musicians, all of whom want your job. So this was a transformer. So anyway, so the long and short of it is, I then volunteered to work on the first year revival of Mass, 72, summer of 72, because members of the Yale Symphony were playing in the street band. And I was music director of the Yale Symphony then. I was, put on the faculty when I was 22 at Yale. And so this is, now I'm, 25, 26. And so I thought, well, I'll meet Leonard Bernstein again. And I didn't, because he wasn't at any of the rehearsals in New York. And I remember saying to my wife, I think they're trying to keep him away. Only in retrospect did I realize why. The company went down to Washington for rehearsals. I went down to Washington with them and stayed in a guest room of a doctor and his wife, whose son was someone I had collaborated with at Yale. And so I got to, be there. And one day, I know Leonard Bernstein, and I'm on stage at the Kennedy Center Opera House, and and I turn a corner, and there's Leonard Bernstein, and I say something like, "Hello, Mr. Bernstein," Those days I pronounced my name Mauceri. This is the way my father pronounced it, because once I started conducting in Europe, it was too complicated to tell people that Mauceri was Mauceri. So we opted for the pronunciation that my grandfather and everyone for generations before that used. But anyway, I'm Mr. Bernstein, John Mauceri. So I didn't know you were working on this. And, this is a story I've told many times, and it is still astounding. I don't know what came over me, because literally I just thought I would hang out. And I was helping Maurice Perez, who was the music director. And I was taking notes for him and, just getting to know this thing. And I thought, well, if Lenny comes, and Mr. Bernstein comes, I'll just to watch him work, because it's interesting, and it was transformative the year before. And then I asked the question, because that night was a run-through. It was the only run-through before the opening. It was a technical run-through. And I said, knowing that Mass is 2 hours without a break, I said, Mr. Bernstein, do you need anyone to take notes for you during the run-through? At which point he said, what a good idea. Harry, give John a ticket to sit with me. So suddenly, I'm going to sit in the box, probably the presidential box, at this public run-through of Mass 1 year later with its original cast, and certain changes have been made for financial reasons. And so I remember calling Betty and saying, I've never done this before. Now I've gotten myself a pretty mess. I've gotten myself into a kind of Laurel and Hardy moment. Mm-hmm. So I remember going out and buying a legal pad and markers, because I'm going to be taking notes in the dark. And being the Virgo that I am, I wrote, introit, simple song, each section. And I still have it's sitting right here where we're recording. I have those notes. I have them all. So indeed, the lights go out, and we go into the box so no one sees Mr. Bernstein coming in. And Mass, begins with a quadraphonic recordings, and then Alan Titus drums his guitar and sings God a Simple Song. So the first notes I'm getting from Lenny in the dark are, the amp light needs to have black tape over it, because you could see the red amp light in the pit, okay? And then more shotgun on Alan. What does that mean? Okay, he meant the shotgun microphone, right? So we get through the whole thing. One of my favorite moments is at the Kadosh. Lenny whispers to me, he said, I stole that from Aaron. And then I think he realized, I don't even know who this kid is next to me. And then he leaned over and said, just kidding. Anyway, so it's over, and there's a production meeting. It's Gordon, and it's Alvin Ailey, it's Oliver Smith, it's the chairman of the board, it's Leonard Bernstein, and me with the notes, right? Wow. I tell you, I never even thought about that. So, so first note, I give the note more, the light, and then more shotgun, and I right through the show, except you get to a meditation, and he said, what's the next note? John? And I go, well, you said that, I start to flip because it's like heresy here, what I'm about to say. You said that that Maurice took the first meditation too slow. Yes, Maurice, and like I don't want to be in the middle of that, right? Anyway, so we get to the end of it, and the next day is a rehearsal with Maestro Bernstein, and then that night is the performance. Okay, so it's the next day, 10 o'clock, I show up, and I take my normal place, which is behind Maurice, just behind just where the first row of orchestra seats are. And Maurice gets in, morning, and somewhere in the first 10 minutes, I hear from behind me, John, where are you? I need you. Because Lenny expected me to be taking notes for him, but Maurice expected me to be taking notes for him. So suddenly I became the most important person in the world, right? So everything stops. They get a walkie-talkie system. So I sit with Leonard Bernstein, but I get messages on the walkie-talkie from Maurice Perez. And then when that's over, there's another meeting in which I've got to deliver the notes. So that's how, fine. So then I go back up to New Haven. I'm writing my dissertation. I get a phone call one day, and, in those days, one phone in the house, right, in the kitchen. And it's Leonard Bernstein. And he says, Giovanni, because he always called me Giovanni. He said, I just found out you weren't being paid to do that work, and I wanted to thank you. And I said, oh, well, and I was completely honest. I said, Mr. Bernstein, I have to tell you I did that for me. If it helped you, I'm really glad. But I got more than I ever would imagine. And he said, well, you're invited to any of my rehearsals. And I said, oh, okay, what's next? He said, well, I'm going back to Tanglewood to do the 4 symphonies of Brahms. So that's the first time I think I actually plotted something. Mm-hmm. I went up a week with Betty, and we stayed at the hotel that he stayed in, spent the money so that I would run into him again. So I suddenly had a pass that said guest artist. I mean, the year before I was a student, and now I was a guest artist, right? Like I was doing anything, but still. So I went when the student conductors got to perform for him. And so he's down by the pool, and I come down at the pool, and he said to me, what did you think of those conductors today? Like, we're equal? And I say, well, Mr. Bernstein, it's really nerve-wracking to conduct for you, so I think they did pretty well. Instead of trying that, he said, I don't know, I don't think they were. So anyway, the bottom line is so lots are going on here. So he's doing Brahms, I guess he's doing 3 and 1 and then 2 and 4, I don't know. So I'm at the rehearsals for that and talking to him a little bit and watching him work with the Boston Symphony. And that's when the news that Hiran Gentila has died in an automobile crash in Sardinia. Now, for those people listening to this who don't know who Hiran Gentila was the appointed general director of the Metropolitan Opera to replace Rudolf Bing. This was a big change because Bing was, the guy. He was the man. Everybody knew Rudolf Bing. He had run the Edinburgh Festival, and he was a very interesting Viennese man, and he finally stepped down, and Gentila was going to open his first season with a new production of Carmen, directed by himself, conducted by Leonard Bernstein with Marilyn Horne and James McCracken. And he dies. And suddenly Lenny's partner in this glorious new future for the Met is no longer there. So it was a terrible day, and I know that Lenny stood before the Boston Symphony and said, I guess you don't do a moment of silence, but, I just learned this news. And anyway, he went on. So end of week, I go back to New Haven. I write him a little note. Thanks so much. See you again sometime, kind of thing. Phone rings. Now, this is really extraordinary. I get a phone call, and it's Harry Kraut, who runs Lenny's office, and says, Lenny's really nervous about Carmen. Now he feels unprotected, and he needs an assistant. So we're wondering if you'd be interested in assisting him at the Met. And I said, I'm working on my dissertation, when would it start? And Harry said, tomorrow. right?
Wow.
And I go, my brain is doing a really quick thing. I had had a meeting with my advisor, Alan Fort, who had determined that perhaps my subject, which I'd been working on for a year or so, wasn't a real subject because it wasn't about 12-tone music. My dissertation was the use of orchestration as a structural element in early 20th century music, which in itself is kind of interesting,
Yeah.
but it means that it's not about pitch. It's about color, about, and I've been working on La Mer and Debussy, and how interesting it is that in La Mer, there are certain themes that are never played with the same instrument, and others which are always, let's say, a muted trumpet. So he's thinking in terms of when a motive is associated with a specific color, and when the development of that other motive would be that its colors change, not its notes, right? Which is really quite interesting, and I thought this would be a really fabulous topic to find other methods of analyzing music. Anyway, Alan Ford said, I'm not really sure this is a dissertation. I thought, oh, Christ, I've been working on this thing, and now I've got my advisor and then there's Lenny Bernstein offering me to start tomorrow for rehearsals at the Metropolitan Opera. So that took me about a millisecond, much longer to explain right here, when I said, okay.
Yeah.
So Lenny gets on the phone, and notoriously he was totally inept with anything technological. And he said, Giovanni, I hear you're going to do this. I said, yes, Mr. Bernstein, I'm happy to. He said, well, I have to give you instructions as to how to get to Fairfield. Now, of course, he was at the country house, and I'm about to get directions to Leonard Bernstein's house on my little kitchen phone as a graduate student faculty member. And Lenny cuts us off, right? He pushes a button and doesn't press hold, and I'm suddenly getting a dial tone. So I quick call Betty, who was at that time working at Silliman Master's office, and she's what we used to call the secretary, and what we used to call the master's office at Yale. And she answers the phone. She says, Silliman's master's office. And I shout, Leonard Bernstein just called me. He wants me to be his assistant for Carmen. It starts tomorrow. I gotta go. Bye. And the master, who's one room away, hears my screaming and says, was John kidding? Actually, I was yelling so loud. And she said, I don't think it didn't sound like he was joking. Anyway, so I get instructions, and that starts my work with him as an assistant. Okay, so Carmen opens. I go to all the performances, dressing room, the whole thing. Famous people come in, Jacqueline Kennedy, Onassis. The whole, how do you deal with all of that? Mm-hmm. And then, you think it's over. So now we're moving forward to answer the question you asked 2 days ago about Candide. I got a phone call. And it's a phone call from the New York Philharmonic. And it's Pierre Boulez wants me to be his assistant at the New York Philharmonic for this time period. I don't know how they got my phone number or whatever, but they did. And would you meet with Maestro, and here's the program. And it was perfect for me because it was the Berg Violin Concerto, which I had conducted, and I knew that Pierre would be the perfect person. And then there was the Ives Three Places in New England, which I had conducted the world premiere of in the restoration for full orchestra. So I would be more knowledgeable than he, right? Yeah. And then we all could meet around Mendelssohn's Reformation Symphony, which neither one of us had any interest in at that time. Pierre Boulez conducting Mendelssohn's Reformation Symphony is already kind of a joke, Pierre Boulez walks into a bar and someone... Yeah. So that's that day. The next day I get the call from Leonard Bernstein's office saying, Lenny would like you to be music director of a new production of Candide in Brooklyn with Hal Prince and Stephen Sondheim, which may go to Broadway. And I go, okay. And then I look at the schedule, and obviously they both conflict date by date. Mm-hmm. There's no way to do both. And there was no way to say no. What would you do, Larry Blank?
Exactly the same as you did.
Right. Yes. So the New York Philharmonic went on strike, as it turned out. God spoke, and I got to be music director of Candide, and I hope that answers your question.
Wow. That's there's more to this question. With all of your training and with all of your knowledge of so many types of music, how did you end up, I hate to say this, being stuck on Broadway for a while? You were doing lots of things, but you ended up doing several other Broadway shows, which was, I'm sure, not your passion or...
No, that's not true. You see, This is what's so interesting about this. I saw it all as a continuum. Growing up on Long Island, Queens, and then, well, Queens, and then we moved out to East Meadow, which is just across the border in Nassau County when I was 10. My aunt Jenny, my godmother, my father's sister, brought me to Broadway when I was 10 years old. So I was seeing, in those days, you see, because now we're talking 1954, 55. So at City Center, they were reviving recent shows. I mean, a revival, of Annie Get Your Gun, it was just, after all, only 6 years old. It wasn't like it came from, 1890. And in those days, what they did was they put together an incredible cast, but then they put the original production up because it was all sitting either at Eve's Costumes or in Secaucus in the warehouse, because after the national tours, they were sitting there for rental. So I saw the original production of Oklahoma. I saw the original production of Carousel, with Barbara Cook and Howard Keel. It's just the most amazing cast in the world. And saw the original Brigadoon. And before I was born, I was being brought up to date. So by the time 1956 rolls around, I'm 10. My mother and I go see My Fair Lady with Julie Andrews, and that's the first Broadway show that I saw in the Broadway theater as the original production in the original venue. So I'm going to Broadway now. So you've got My Fair Lady. The next year you've got West Side Story and The Music Man. 2 years later you've got Gypsy. I'm going to all of those things, right? Because I'm a New Yorker.
You're a New York kid.
But then there's Aunt Rose, who's on the other side of the family, my mother's side of the family, and she's married to Uncle Jim, who is one of the funniest people in the world, a dentist, but has absolutely no interest in opera. And Aunt Rose has got a subscription to the Met every other Friday. And she calls me up. Now it's about a few years later. I'm like 13 or 14. And she says, John, I'm so tired of Uncle Jim falling asleep in Act 2 of the opera. Would you come to the opera with me? I go, okay, sure. Right? So I'm going to the opera on Friday nights, and I get to see everything because, unlike Broadway, there's one house manager at the Met, as opposed to a house manager for all those different theaters when you write for tickets, So what happened was you'd write a self-addressed stamped envelope, and we're New Yorkers, so we're street smart, right? Some people play stickball, some people sell drugs, people smoke. I got tickets to the opera. That's what I did. So I figured out when our tickets become available to something I want to see, a non-subscription or this or that, and I would send the letter, first class, with a self-addressed stamped envelope and a check with a little note. Hello, I am 16 years old and would like to see Madame Nielsen sing her first Aida. Hello, I am 16 years old. I saw everything because one person, I think it was Al Hubei was his name, saw this kid and was one of my guardian angels. I got tickets for everything. Everything. I saw Maria Callas return to the Met. I saw Joan Sutherland make her debut. I saw the complete Ring cycle that Birgit Nielsen sang the first time. And plus I had my Friday night. My Friday nights included Birgit Nielsen's first Aida. It included Leontine Price and Franco Corelli making their debut the same night in just another night of an old Trovatore production. So as far as whether Broadway was a kind of like slumming or something different from opera, no, it was all one continuum in my life. So when Lenny asked me to do Candide, it was okay, sure, why not? And that's how it didn't feel odd at all. In fact, one of the reasons that I did song and dance for Andrew with Bernadette was that Andrew came to Covent Garden where I was conducting La Boheme, and he saw my bio that I had been on Broadway with Candide, and he thought, this is interesting. This guy is conducting operas at the Royal Opera House, and he's done Broadway. So I get a note from Andrew saying, Madeline and I would love for you to come have lunch. I go, okay. So I go have lunch, and Andrew, and he was lovely, and he said, I don't suppose, he said, I didn't suppose you'd ever consider conducting my music now, would you? And I thought, oh yeah, I'd do that. For a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that I liked his music, but also because it allowed me to be home. I mean, I could take the subway up to the theater, conduct and come home. We had moved to New York by this point, had a kid, and I might actually act like I was a kind of normal father. So in my life, the Broadway shows that I did, that, On Your Toes was a really special thing. That was the other part of my life, which is the restoration of things. To some extent, Candide became that because the structure of that Candide, the first one I did, was a 2-hour, no intermission, new book. Half the songs, they didn't know what would go in them. So it said overture, and then it said opening number, question mark. Oh, thank you very much. At one point it said Inca or Aztec ballet, question mark. I went, okay, what is that going to be? So I became the person who was given Leonard Bernstein's trunk material. And Lenny wrote music for Candide from 1956 to 1971. Every time there was a new production of Candide, he wrote something more for it. So there's a lot of music. But, of course, there wasn't room for all of that music, but there was options here. So, for example, opening number, I knew that the new script wasn't going to go to Venice, and they needed to introduce the characters. So I knew Lady Frilly, Lady Silly was not going to ever be in the show, so I suggested to Hal and to Steve, you could introduce each of these characters with the way this music works in the counterpoint. And they liked that idea, so Steve went off and wrote Life is Happiness Indeed to the music that was written for the Venice Gavotte, etc. So I was a partner in creating what music could get new lyrics, and Steve would be writing them. And few of them I wrote, actually, at some point or other, because, when you do a musical, everybody's
working together.
Yeah,
so.
And we're all in that. So that was that, but On Your Toes was the first real, can you raise the money and actually put a show on Broadway from the 30s, being legitimately respectful of the original material, which means that the original orchestrations and dance arrangements and keys are all there. So we don't have new arrangements, right? We don't mix meat and dairy here. So that if the show comes from 1936, On Your Toes, it'll sound like 1936. And I remember asking Hal about George Abbott. George was 95, 96 at the time, and I said, could Mr. Abbott direct On Your Toes or a show? And Hal said, of course, he's hard of hearing. He said, but absolutely he could direct. So I contacted Mr. Abbott, who was living in Florida, and I said, I think that of the shows you wrote with Rodgers and Hart, the best one would be The Boys from Syracuse, 1938. And he was gung-ho for that. And so we started on that until Roger Stevens, who ran the Kennedy Center, found out that The Boys from Syracuse was based on a comedy of errors by Shakespeare. And he just lost God knows how many millions of dollars on something called Oh Brother.
I remember that.
Which is, right, which had a great cast and had the famous song, Bangle Layton, oh Peck Maiden, say that you'll be mine. You don't remember that
I
one?
saw the show, but it slipped my memory.
She said, and Roger, in perfect, said, I'm not going to put any money in any goddamn show about any goddamn twins. I said, okay, fine. So now we're back to square one. So I speak to Mr. Abbott, who by this point he said, call me George, but for the listeners now, I'll still call him Mr. Abbott. I said, well, Mr. Abbott, it seems to me that the other two shows that you did with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Hart are Pal Joey and On Your Toes. I didn't want to do, I Married an Angel. He said, well, send me the script. So we got, those, in those days, those scripts were typed and you had onion skin, copies. So we got both those shows, sent the scripts to him. After all, he wrote those scripts, right? So I waited a few days and I called him and I said, well, Mr. Abbott, what do you think? He said, well, they're both lousy. He said, but everybody thinks Pal Joey's good, which it isn't. So let's do On Your Toes and surprise them. So that's how it became On Your Toes. And what made that so fabulous was that in the Rogers office, they didn't in those days give permission for any first-class production of any show that Rogers wrote, whether it was with Hart or with Hammerstein, until they saw it. So in order to protect the property, you couldn't get first-class rights for Broadway. Roger Stevens would not put money into it unless he had the rights for Broadway. So I had, again, one of those situations. So there had to be a meeting with Dorothy Rogers and Mary Rogers Gettle to persuade them to let us do On Your Toes. At the same time, one of the people working in the Rogers office said that he had seen old Hans at Russell's funeral. Now, again, I'm sure the people who listen to this know who I'm talking about, but Robert Russell Bennett and Hans Bialik were the two great orchestrators. The sound of Broadway was created by those two men. So I said to Bob, I said, you mean Hans was alive a few years ago? I mean, because we all thought that Hans was older than dirt because he disappeared, right? We have his name, kind of, and then he disappears. We assume he's dead, but it turns out that not only was he alive, but so we did what we could do, which is that we called the union, and the music union said Hans Bialik. And the answer was, we don't have a phone number, but here's his address. So then we called information. Ladies and gentlemen listening to this, there was something called information, and where you operate.
There were also phone books.
Yeah, there were phone books and things. And I said, Hans Bialik on, East 72nd Street, wherever he lived, and which like saying, it's like saying George Washington, Mount Vernon, have a phone number for that. And so the operator said, oh, that phone number is, and gave me his phone number. Now I'm looking at this and I'm trying to do the math here. If I call Hans Bialik and let's say he's under the care of a nurse and I have, one of those out-of-body phone conversations, I'm going to write to this person. So I get Kennedy Center Stationery, dear Mr. Bialik, Mr. Abbott, and my phone number. And I don't know, I've gone to the gym or something, it's like 3 or 4 days later, and there's a message written by the housekeeper, and it writes, Mr. Bialik called, call him any time, any day from, I think it said something like 1 in the afternoon until 2 o'clock in the morning. So I knew that he was still living on orchestration time. Right?
Which I understand.
You know that really well, Larry. So I call Hans, and my couple of assistants go up there to his house and find old Hans, who is one of those people who is blessed with a photographic memory. I mean, he was 80 in the shade, as Gilbert and Sullivan would say, and he remembered everything. In fact, he remembered meeting me because his daughter had a place in Santa Fe, and when I was conducting Lulu in Santa Fe, he said, "Oh yes, I remember when you came into my daughter's shop and you were there and with your wife." And I went, this guy is amazing, right? So we had the original orchestrator. We had George Abbott. George had contacted Mark Makarova to take the lead of the ballerina. So we had the greatest ballerina in the world. Okay, so now I have to have the meeting with the Rogers ladies. And I arrive at the Rogers office, in my suit and everything, just as Dorothy Rogers and Mary show up together, and we get into the elevator. Now, this is another one of those long stories, but I'll tell it anyway. We're in the elevator, and Mary looks at me and she says, Adam wants to go, is a composer now and wants to go to Yale.
Mm-hmm. Ah. I smell this one.
Well, not quite, because the source of the smell you don't know about, because when I was conducting at City Opera, there was a bohème in which after Act 2, I showed up at the commissary, which was a machine you put quarters in, and you got something heated to the point where hopefully you didn't die from what was in the can. And this kid, dressed as, a kid in Act 2 of La Bohème, comes up to me and says, "Hey, I noticed that baton you're using has got a cork handle, right?" And I say, "Yeah, it does." I said, the man who makes those batons makes them for Leonard Bernstein. I mean, they're really wonderful. He said, "Oh, I'd just like to see it." So I said, "Well, come by sometime. I'll show it to you." And off he goes. dressed as an urchin, and someone says, "You know who that is?" I go, "No." Well, that's Richard Rogers' grandson, Adam Gettle. He was 10 years old. Mm-hmm. So now Adam is 16 and wants to go to Yale. So I say to Mary, well, have Adam come by the house and have him play me some of his music, right? So then we have our meeting, and they're pretty tough about giving anybody the rights to do a show that they control. Yeah. Until I looked at Dorothy Rogers and I said, Mrs. Rogers, I've never seen a show that your husband wrote with Mr. Hart, and I'd kind of like to see it. And it had never quite occurred to her, who had seen every one of those shows, open and close, mm-hmm. revivals. And so here was this guy saying, I just would like to see one. And we've got the original director, we've got this, we got that. And so we got permission. Then Adam came, and in this room where you and I are right now, Adam sat at the piano behind you, and played a new composition that he had written. And it was dazzling, of course. And I called Mary and I said, I think I've heard the new century. And he got into Yale. He got into Yale because he's Adam and not because of my letter, but he got into Yale. And then he would come down on the train and sit in the pit when I was conducting Hans's orchestrations of On Your Toes. He was getting to know, because Adam is so smart, he's such a genius, but listening to how the orchestra worked and all of that. And so I was kind of filling in some of the history that he was actually unaware of at the time. Why did we start? What is this the answer to what question?
Well,
is it still today?
We're talking about Broadway and how it all evolved, but you got to where I wanted you to go, which was On Your Toes, and hearing the history of it, and also all this other interesting information. But the great thing about On Your Toes was getting Hans involved.
Well, not only that, but Hans, having Hans visit this room, for example, and tell his stories about singing under Mahler, about World War I and being a prisoner of war in Russia at the time of the Great Revolution, and how he played concerts after the war, and how that brought people together, and how he escaped through South America, came up and was a copyist for Victor Herbert, and sat behind or in front of or next to Robert Russell Bennett, who was also a copyist. So those two guys who knew this were copyists together. He always called Bennett Russell, and it was an extraordinary time. And we managed to get money from the National Endowment for him to restore Anything Goes. And he was working on Pal Joey when he died. And so with the rest of that grant money, we worked on getting Lady in the Dark put together, which had, of course, nothing to do with Hans, but it was a useful way to use the rest of the grant money. But yeah, Hans was having a man in my life, in this room, talk to me about singing under Gustav Mahler as a boy soprano in Vienna, and imitating him, imitating the way he walked, imitating the way he conducted, was some. How can you talk about that? When I was 27, Yale gave the Howland Prize to Leopold Stokowski, who was 90, and I became his assistant for the last year he was in America. Stokowski told me stories about many, many things. In fact, his secretary said, I've never heard the maestro tell stories like this, because normally he talks about the future. And obviously Stokowski thought telling me a story means I would tell it again. Mm-hmm. He saw in me, I like grandpas now that I am one, but even then I just liked old guys telling stories. Women too, of course, but for the most part, because in the field I'm in, the composers I got to meet and arrangers and the conductors were men. So here's, without discussing that, Stokowski talked to me about watching Mahler prepare for the world premiere of the Eighth Symphony in Munich. And how he got into rehearsals, which were closed, was by going to a pawn shop and getting an empty violin case. And he walked in with the rest of the orchestra. And he said, "Guten Morgen," and then he'd go up to the balcony and watch rehearsals, which is how he...
Wow.
And so in my life, I had two people talk to me about experiencing Gustav Mahler live.
So
we're talking about a man who died in 1911, and now we're sitting here, and I'm talking to you in 2024 about Hans, who sang under Mahler, and Stokey, who watched him rehearse, and what they had to say about that experience. This is a miracle of music, right? We stop time.
it's our experiences that we're passing on firsthand.
Yeah.
You know, because the people we both have met in our trajectory.
Yeah, and who would have thought, it's like when Lenny, after World War II, said he traveled, I think, to Amsterdam to see Furtwängler conduct. And he said, I figured I have to see him, Nazi and schmaltzy, I've got to see him.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it was worth the trip because it was mesmeric, what he did. You see, old films of this wobbly hand and this gigantic, ungainly looking man. You go, oh, I guess. You listen to recordings and you go, oh, well, I guess. But, recordings are just amber. They freeze something, but they don't ever represent the relationship of the live performance with the live audience,
Sure.
which is the key to everything, right? So in this case, even Stokowski had a Furtwängler story. It was so funny to hear the admiration. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but Stokowski told me that he was walking in the Alps, a walking stick, and it had rained, and he was sitting at a, conditorei or whatever, and he was covered in mud from slipping, and he looked, and there was this tall guy sitting at another table, and he was covered with mud, and they looked at each other, and they just laughed at how revolting they both looked. So Stokowski went over to him, and Stokowski said, you know who that was? He said, it was Furtwängler.
Wow.
So there's a two-character play, or one in your mind at least.
Well, I was telling you earlier in our discussions how I was 12, 13 years old and saw Robert Russell Bennett on the street and went over and introduced myself.
I think this story is even better because of who he was with, that you chose the orchestrator. So you have to tell your listeners, if you haven't already.
Well, I was standing on the corner of 51st Street and Broadway by what was Lindy's at the time. Mm-hmm. And there was a show called On a Clear Day, which was in rehearsals and going to play the Mark Hellinger Theater. And I saw these three gentlemen walking around the corner, and I was like you, a New Yorker, and I loved musical theater, and these three guys were walking by, and I saw them. It was Alan J. Lerner, Burton Lane, and Robert Russell Bennett, and I chose to go up to Robert Russell Bennett and introduce myself.
Doesn't that say everything?
These other guys, who are they?
I love it. I love it. It's a good story.
Well, it's fascinating, though, but talking to Hans, not only did you hear about Furtwängler and Mahler, but also the history of Broadway, which you were now heavily ensconced in.
Yeah.
And I had the good fortune of meeting Hans as well, but very briefly, when he was copying my music.
Mm. Wow.
And then I found out that my music was actually his music because I didn't know who he was. I knew his name, but I was at Associated Music on, I think it was 47th or 48th Street, which was Russell Bennett's office as well. And I was orchestrating a Rodgers and Hart show for a production in Chicago. This would have been 1975. And
do you remember what show?
It was a revival of the Rodgers and Hart show that had just happened on Broadway.
I see, right.
In 75, and they were reducing the orchestra.
Of course. They never expanded, do they?
The other way. And I actually had a bass player who doubled on harp. And I was writing it, and this little gentleman calls me over and says, I orchestrated this originally. And
he certainly did.
And he said, this is very interesting what you wrote. And he gave me instructions on how to write harp, which I told you about before. And I remember it now.
Yeah. Sure. And every time you write for harp, there's Hans. Old Hans is with you. Yeah, that's the part of this thing, how we mentor each other, mm-hmm. and how we want to tell people who want to receive that information. See, if Stokowski was telling me about spending time with Sibelius, or
not the program, you mean?
I mean the composer, staying at his house, or being in Russia after the Great Revolution, which he referred to as the Great Revolution, to make me know that he knew about the other revolutions before it. And one of the things he said was the smell of garbage was appalling. And of course, it had never occurred to me that when there's a revolution, the sanitation department doesn't show up, right, on Thursdays. But then, and so all of his interactions, whether it was with Mahler or Sibelius, Shostakovich, and going to the island of Java, where he bought a gamelan because he wanted to have one like the ones that Debussy and Ravel heard at the Paris exhibition, and it was hanging on his wall. We're having lunch, we're having pea soup and salmon for lunch, and he's got the gamelan.
Wow.
So, but why me is the question, right? They're a lot more famous, but I was a sponge. I was, this was all being put in my hard drive. So allowing me to retell these stories. And one of the things I always did, though, is when I go back to New Haven and I would repeat when it happened into my cassette machine or into my Wallensack tape recorder. So I didn't start, embroidering these stories, but could actually tell them as, within, an aide-memoire. So, but again, I was as comfortable being at the opera with Leonard Bernstein and Carmen as I was on Broadway with Candide. And On Your Toes allowed me to fill in the gap before the 40s when I was seeing those shows in revival, and the 50s when I was actually seeing the shows, etc. But back to the 30s when you could get to, to get to Rodgers and Hart and get to people who actually created. So when Hans was teaching me about tempos, this was really an incredibly valuable experience.
Just because of the timeline, I'm going to tell you where we reconnected at that point, because it was about that point. I was conducting regularly on Broadway around the early 80s, doing one flop after another. Well, you had
it's a good title for a show.
Yeah,
one flop after another, exclamation point.
And I was doing a show that was trying out in Seattle called Colette, written by Harvey Schmidt and Tom
I remember
Jones.
it well.
And you were sent out by Roger Smith.
Yeah, Roger Stevens, and I was
Smith,
his
that was a hotel.
Yeah.
Roger Stevens.
Well, he was also an actor, but the other thing about it is that I was Roger's advisor on music theater,
right,
for more than a decade.
And you came out to Seattle, and I was probably the only person in the building that you knew on this horrible show. Actually, it was a beautiful show, just not successful. And you told me that you were there to determine whether Roger was going to continue as an investor on the show. And I remember you invited me to dinner and told me flat out that, your advice was to close the show, which was the correct advice, and we discussed the show. But that's...
And painful, by the way, because there were some really good things about the show, but there were so many wrong decisions that were made, and also that's really useful. When you're given that position, you're in an analytical phase. You still have to understand that your responsibility is to save these shows. Maybe they're great, maybe they're kind of good. So the last thing you want to do is advise not. But but if you remember, the woman playing Colette, who was 5 foot tall in life, was being played by Dana Rigg, who was 6 foot tall, and had no musical chops particularly. And the entire set was built seemingly out of black velvet. It just sucked the energy right out of the audience and out the other side. So no matter what you did, you could do Hamilton meets Oklahoma and it would have been a flop in that set. I don't even know who, So it was too late to fix all those things.
Oh, absolutely.
But I still sing the Vagabond number because I love it. I love that number.
There was some nice music in the show, and it was brilliantly orchestrated by Larry Wilcox.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a big orchestra at that time. It was, 26, 28,
Yeah,
which
that's
was a
big.
huge Broadway orchestra of the day. And I remember you sat and said, the music's fine.
Yeah.
That's not the problem, but the show had all these other issues, which I totally agreed with you about. And I must say now, we sat in Seattle for a month doing nothing. We didn't fix anything. The show just lay there. And it was the right advice, and
so that's when we met the next time I see.
Yeah,
I get it.
And then we met again later at the Bowl, where you employed me.
Yeah, imagine that. So it's good to be for the Book of Time that I once actually paid you to do something.
Absolutely, that's going on record right now. And recently we've been working together on another project, which I think you should talk about, called Blues Opera. And please tell a little bit about it.
Well, there is an unknown, forgotten, two-act opera by Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer, based loosely on St. Louis Woman, the musical, expanded, and which never saw the light of day. It was abandoned by Mercer and Arlen in 1959. There was no producer, no one wanted to do it. The idea, and so it sort of stopped, and then it became a kind of a musical called Free and Easy in Europe, where it had a sputtery kind of life and then ended. And so this work came to my attention because of Tommy Krasker. Tommy produced a lot of the records that I was honored to conduct, and Tommy was one of my students at Yale, and he was the research assistant from heaven. I mean, just the greatest guy. And I recorded a suite from it in a Hollywood Bowl on Broadway. Anyway, I've often wondered about this thing called blues opera, and when I ran into Quincy Jones at a hard hat, meeting of an opening of a facility in Los Angeles, I asked him about it because he was music director in his 20s of this last version, a kind of musical version of a thing called Free and Easy. And he smiled and he said, "Oh, well, you'll never find it because there was no score. We played from memory." He had an orchestra on stage. His band was on stage. So it's always been to be in the back of my throat of things to do. And with COVID, it became my COVID, kind of hobby. There was no work. There's no work. And the head archivist of Rodgers and Hammerstein, Bruce Pomahak, may he rest in peace, told me when I ran into him at a recording session of The King and I, said with Kelly O'Hara, said, I just met this kid who just graduated from Columbia. His name is Michael Gilden, and I think, you should get to know him. He's just this great kid. So I meet Michael Gilden, which is Gildin, so it's this really strange spelling. And we start to talk about projects, and I mention this. And he's the greatest sleuth I've ever met. I mean, he is, for music theater, he's Sherlock Holmes. And so he finds a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of a piano vocal score that says blues opera. And it's the first page, and the last page is curtain. You couldn't read the notes because it was one of those degraded copies of copies. So a sharp, a flat, a double sharp, who knows? But it meant that there was an actual something score of this thing. Mm-hmm. So in the hunt, and it was a hunt, I mean, really, we've worked on this for now 4 years, we not only found a pristine copy of that piano vocal score, which was copyrighted and at the Library of Congress, but we also found 9 other songs that Arlen and Mercer wrote after that, before they abandoned it. And so the job was, can we restore this thing? What is it? The magic moment came when Gilden found in doing searches in archives and libraries that there were reel-to-reel tape recordings in boxes that had never been opened. It said blues opera, box 1, blues opera, box 2. And it's a tribute to the librarians and archivists of the world that in the middle of the pandemic, when nobody was leaving home, without wearing hazmat suits, these people actually opened those boxes, digitized them for us, charged us $75 for their work, wow. And we were able to glue together a working audio recording, piano and singers, of all of blues opera. We, for the first time, could see how long it was, what the length, and the 9 songs we had to figure out where to put them because They weren't part of the original score. So we started working on this thing and then searching for librettos and what is the story and finding the underlying story and how it was changed. Because unlike, say, Porgy and Bess, the underlying stories were written by black people. In fact, the underlying story was written by Arne de Bontemps, who was one of the Harlem Renaissance poets and great writer, mostly forgotten. He grew up in Los Angeles, as it turns out. He wrote a book in 1931, which is the basis of these stories. And the stories in that book, God Sends Sunday, are recollections of his great uncle, who was born after the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's about this amazing character in Arne's life. Now, that book then becomes adapted into a play called St. Louis Woman, which he writes with another Harlem Renaissance poet named County Cullen, and it has a few performances in the 30s. Then it re-emerges as a Broadway musical, which most of your listeners will know, called St. Louis Woman. The story of St. Louis Woman is really a middle part of God Sends Sunday and takes a minor character and makes her the major character. It does a lot of stuff. That show was not a success, but it has some of one of the great scores of Arlen and Mercer. So, in order to understand why there's this opera that's loosely based on that, you have to go to Robert Breen, who was producer and director of a international touring company of Porgy and Bess in the 50s. I mean, this was one of the most successful tours of anything. But, this is when Leontine Price and Bill Warfield were Bess and Porgy. And it went to South America, it went to Europe, and it even went to the Soviet Union. Now, he realized, Breen, that he needed more repertory. And he thought, well, there should be another Porgy and Bess. And I think people listening to this might ask the question, how come there isn't why are there not other Porgys and Besses? Because after all, if we still look at that as the great American opera, why is it as one-off kind of thing, as the English would say? So it turns out that Cab Calloway, who was singing the role of Sport and Life, has a conversation with Breen, and Breen says, I'd like to commission an opera, kind of like Porgy and Bess, for the company, but in the style of popular music, but an opera like Porgy and Bess, because their Porgy and Bess that they toured was the opera. It wasn't Cheryl Crawford talk, sing. It was mostly sung all the way through. So Cab Calloway said to Breen, well, what music are you thinking of? And so Breen listed a number of songs, and Cab Calloway said to him, well, they were all written by the same guy, right? And Breen didn't know. He said, well, they were all written by Harold Arlen. And Breen said, oh, well, what is he doing these days? So that started this process, and Arlen and Mercer, and we don't have all of this, we don't have all of the correspondence, but they realized that of all the things that they have done or could do, taking St. Louis Woman and expanding it, cutting certain aspects of the libretto that were unsuccessful or were now no longer possible because they were insulting, and turn it into something epic, because God knows they knew their opera, they created something called blues opera. Now, why did they call it blues opera? Well, they called it blues opera because those are two words that didn't need translating. Because everybody in the world knew what the blues are, and everybody knew what an opera was. So if you started calling it free and easy or whatever, you'd have to then
explain it.
Yeah. Explain it. So they wrote this amazing thing, and they were auditioning and recording the numbers as they were writing them. So we were able to glue it all together. Now, it was so awesome to listen to this, because no one thinks of Arlen as a through composer. He's a songwriter, right? Not a composer. But that turns out not to be true. And subsequently I learned that Johnny Mercer felt he really wasn't, he wrote lyrics to some songs, but had never had the big success of a triumphant Broadway musical. So he still saw himself as somehow being second rate, even though arguably he was as good, if not better, than almost any lyricist of the 20th century. Now we had this work. We had, yes, clumsy, but we could hear it from the beginning to the end with people and a piano. and we could start to see where these other 9 songs would have gone. And then we went through the process of the rights, because there were a lot of people who were involved with that, and no one ever got the rights worked out for St. Louis Woman in 1946, 47. So everyone's dead, of course, who were writing it. So now we're dealing with the estates and people. At the same time, we also had to figure out, what are the words? How does this arc? How does it work? Luckily, because of my years of doing things like working on Your Toes or working on Candide, I'm pretty good at plunking songs into the right place and what it might mean. And because of having read the source material, we could understand that this song obviously was a way to understand better who Della Green is, who Augie is, what the relationship, because opera is basically a ritual. It's a parable or it's a ritual. Sometimes it's an action, but it's fundamentally it's a lesson. All operas are lessons. They're high mass. They're holy days. They're meant to change us a bit. So whether that's Don Giovanni or whether that's Madame Butterfly or it's blues opera, there's something about this art form which is so special and important. And they understood that and created this immensely impressive, I'll say, masterpiece called blues opera. Now, and I've said to you, Larry, because as the listeners will soon know, we asked you to orchestrate it. And one of the things that makes it so interesting, of the many things, is that in 1959, when it had never been performed, and mind you, it still has never been performed, Andrei Kostelanetz got to see the piano vocal score and thought it was so great that he commissioned an orchestral suite from blues opera, which he recorded with the New York Philharmonic and performed in Carnegie Hall in the presence of the composer, Harold Arlen. That orchestration, which sits in the New York Philharmonic Library, is the Rosetta Stone, because everything in it is in the same keys as the opera, and it amounts to something like 25 or 27 minutes of what it should sound like, even though the opera is 2 hours and 45 minutes long. So we know where the harp would be, whether there was a piano in it, how many woodwinds there would be. The whole basic sound world is there. And not only is it there on page, it's there in performance, because Harold Arlen was sitting there with Andrei Kostelanetz.
Done in the presence of the composer.
Yeah, so in the presence of the composer, and the piano vocal score has certain cues for instrumentation also along the way. So that's where Larry Blank comes in on this, like who's going to orchestrate this thing? Who's going to be willing to abrogate any personal, I need to, put my stamp on it so that it sounds like me, and understand the historicity and, what is it, but also make it contemporary. And you said yes. And why don't you tell your listener about blues opera, about your personal experience? Because when this has been recorded for your podcast, we have just completed, you and I, 2 days of going through the full score, which you have now completed, and we've all worked on this together, and now we're just kind of fixing things, dynamics, doublings, and stuff like that. But what you've done is as great a work as anyone could do, and I personally see this as the most important restoration in my 55 years of restoring stuff. I think it's the greatest gift I can leave behind, for people to re-establish and re-evaluate both Arlen and Mercer. But now over to Larry.
Well, I mean, the orchestrations were done by Samuel Metlofsky, known as Sandy Metlofsky, who conducted the original Threepenny Opera at the Theatre de Lys
in New York.
New York, and also had the distinction of conducting the musical Kelly in 1965, and wrote a lot of television music, especially a few episodes of Star Trek. Very capable conductor and composer and pianist. And obviously, Arlen must have been happy to have him there. And as you said, it was 27 minutes worth. And the music is just staggering. Arlen, of course, was a great songwriter, but the counterpoint in this score and just the whole piece is quite amazing to listen to. But what interested me, as we discussed, I felt the same way you did. This music had to come back to life and be presented for what it is. And Arlen was a contemporary of Gershwin's. And
unlike Gershwin, who died very young, the legacy of that era, of those composers, those children of immigrants composers, continued way up, decades after Gershwin's death. And it was, in fact, Gershwin who thought that Arlen was the most original one of us. He said that.
Well, so for me, it was a great honor, and I was very flattered that you asked me to do it. And I, like you, came up knowing and meeting a lot of the people who created all the music the generations ahead of us.
Right.
Like Hans and Robert Russell Bennett and Phil Lang, and my mentor, Erwin Kostel, who orchestrated the West Side Story with Sid Raymond. And this is, for me, the culmination of everything that came before me.
Yep.
And brought me to where I am today. So I feel exactly the same way. It's a fantastic restoration, and if I did nothing else for the rest of my life, I've worked on blues opera with
Well,
you.
I'll tell you, I agree with you there that we always love the newborn here, I suppose, the latest, but I think everything I've done up until blues opera will diminish compared to the gift to society of reestablishing or establishing this work that is an American opera. There's no question it's an opera. I remember when I played it for John McWhorter, who helped us to some extent, making sure the libretto was all within the bounds of taste and there wasn't too much kind of minstrel black. Let's remember that unlike Porgy and Bess, as I said, this is based on a black story and based on a play written by black men. So it's not like it's all the invention of white people trying to be black. On the other hand, both Arlen and Mercer were white guys, but Arlen, as you know, Ethel Waters said he's the most, I don't know, the blackest white man I've ever met, or something exactly like that. Because who was he? He was writing for the Cotton Club.
What's amazing too is the characters in this are not the poor black people of Porgy and Bess.
Not a bit.
These are erudite, successful,
rich people. Right. That doesn't mean that they don't, murder. One person gets murdered, and there's, it's like Carmen, or it's like any opera where there's a murder. On the other hand, this is an uplifting story of love and transformation of two people at the end, which is just extraordinary. Now, there are a couple of things here that your listeners might want to know about blues opera. One of the great moments was Angel Blue, who is arguably the most important African-American opera singer in the world. I performed with Angel in the London Philharmonic. We did Strauss's Four Last Songs. We met in London. We had a really good time. When this started to emerge, I started to share some music with her, and she completely gets it and is completely committed to singing the world premiere as the St. Louis Woman when the opera is produced. So she will do new productions of blues opera everywhere because everyone wants Angel. She's doing the new Aida at the Met, for example, and etc. Then comes this other aspect of the opera, which is that it celebrates a time, as you said, where there's a time in history of black history where people are happy and are not the downtrodden. There's no dumb character here. We don't laugh at anyone. Having the scene in Porgy and Bess with the lawyer, that is a complication. To divorce a woman who's never been married that's a complication. It's right out of Amos and Andy. Mm-hmm. It's a laughter at people being that ignorant and that stupid, and you really get the kind of creeps about that. But within that context, however, or the larger context, what Gershwin did was pure genius. And we forgive some of that because the opera is now just American music. It's not black, white, Jewish. It's just American music. So in the case of blues opera, we have something that will, I think, transform our history of American opera. That's a pretty big mouthful, but it will, because it's not just that he wrote expanded the vocabulary of St. Louis Woman. They smartly decided to use some of the hit songs and embed them into the score along with the new music. And those songs, which we know now, are given dramatic function in the larger storytelling. So if Blues in the Night or Old Black Magic come into the score, and usually they're just echoes of those songs, not the whole, not the bridge, not the verse, just whatever it is, some part of it. It's now part of a story in which we know something, we recognize it, but now it has a meaning, in a larger meaning. So although people come to Porgy and Bess now and they know Summertime and A Woman is a Sometimes Thing, this will work the same way, which is that I know that song. Oh, is that from this? Now, in order to explain that, and this is really significant, Arlen said he always kept his jots, J-O-T-S. Whenever he had an idea for a tune, a theme, he would jot it down, and he kept these jots. And with the idea that someday he would write a long-form music theater work based on the blues. So he did say that if people recognize some of these jots as having been hit songs, that's just because they come from the same kind of drawer, the same cauldron of creativity. And so when you go back to the source of this, I mean, the leitmotifs, the kind of curse motif, the theme for Della, the theme, really, it's Wagnerian in that sense, and even the do-do-do, which is da-hooey, da-hooey, what is it? Ooh, that's the last little fragment you hear at the very end of the opera. Do-do-do. Oh, my mama done told me, and you get ooh. So he is thinking that these jots become expanded, like you add water and it just explodes. And I mean, the day that we finally glued it all together, and I looked at it on my computer, and it was 2 hours and 45 minutes of music, I looked at Michael Gill and I said, look at this thing. So we invited McWhorter over to look at the piano vocal before we had it engraved, so we had a photocopy of the handwritten. And he sat in the chair behind you, Larry, and he kept shaking his head going, this is an opera, but this is an opera. This is not, He thought maybe it was a kind of a jukebox opera because there were some hit songs in it. Inevitably, when we play excerpts from this, some point in playing it, the person listening to it for the first time, inevitably, both hands go to their face and they say, why have I never heard this before? And it's just one of those, as it were, Cole Porter, things in the history of just moving on. So House of Flowers, Jamaica, Lil Abner, whatever, A Star is Born, the things they were working on, and then life, and they couldn't produce it, and they were busy making a living and getting through life. And because there was no particular interest in putting money into an opera, in 1959, American opera, Breen actually has been fired from Porgy and Bess, so he had no company to give it to. It just went away. And this is where, when we started this conversation about On Your Toes and Candide, this is one of the great joys of my life. I started out, I was telling you earlier, as a composer. But I thought, as a conductor, there's something more interesting. In a funny way, less me, because you're a translator of somebody else's music. You can't say, I wrote it. No, but there's plenty of music that needs to be played. It's not like we've run out of tunes, right? And, in my life, so much of it has to do with refugee composers in World War II, and why don't we play all that music that Hitler banned, and there's a lot going on. Well, in the American story, of which the refugee composers is a major part, there's this issue of something like blues opera, and there are some others that are waiting in the queue as to other operas and music theater works that we have to get to. So we're now at the point, as of today, where, when you add some of the corrections we made and some of the balances, we have a full score and a full orchestral score, full piano vocal score. G. Schirmer is publishing it, and they're taking it to market to opera houses. And I also believe that at some point it'll be a West End or a Broadway production like Les Miserables, because it can be produced as in music theater terms, because the singers can be opera singers. It asks the same questions and makes the same demands. You can see, for example, that when Gershwin wrote Porgy and Bess and had John W. Bubbles was the non-opera singer, right? Then you know that Breen had suggested to Arlen that a Cab Calloway role needs to be in there, and there is one. There is one. And yeah, he doesn't sing A Woman Is a Sometimes Thing. Instead, he sings an equally wonderful song. So we have roles there for an all-black cast based on black stories of black history. And the people we've reached out to who might object to an opera written by two white people, who would be the first, we believe, to say, no, we don't need any of that anymore, are the ones who said, we really need that because it's about joy and it's about uplift and it's about collaboration. So although, I can't predict what people are going to say about the appropriateness of this work, it is a work of genius, inspired by black culture. And the black culture had accepted the music of Harold Arlen right from the beginning. Now this is really significant because Lena Horne and Ethel Waters and Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington were all playing this man's music.
All the time.
More so than Gershwin, by the way, right? So that's Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and Ethel Merman. When you think about Gershwin, the Rhapsody in Blue it honestly says this is where this music comes from, the blues. And that was 100 years ago. Now we have this man who was writing for Cotton Club and writing for these great black artists, now writing an opera for an all-black company. It's quite exciting.
Well, we have so much more to say. I'm so glad we got to talk about this. I'm especially glad we got to talk a little bit about blues opera. We're going to have to do another one of these podcasts, the next step in blues opera.
Oh, you bet.
But really a pleasure for me to be working with you, to be talking with you, and dining with you. And I hope we get to do this again very soon.
Thank you, Larry. Lovely to be with you as always.